am here today for the first Tuesdays at the Table conversation. My guest is Dr. David Field, author and scholar, academic coordinator of the Methodist E-Academy, and the new ecumenical staff officer of the COB. Welcome, David.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
David, tell us a little bit about your academic background and your professional background.
Well, perhaps just to note first, I originally come from South Africa and studied theology and religion in South Africa, graduated from the University of Cape Town with a master's and later a PhD. And then I taught at a number of institutions in South Africa, the university that was then called the University of Transkei, and then moved on to Africa University in Zimbabwe. For the past 20 years almost now, I've been living in Europe. It was purely a love change. My wife happens to be German, and when we got married, I decided to move here and spent a lot of time in that 20 years actually looking after our family and our household while my wife was a full-time pastor. And then I've been running Methodist E-Academy, which is an online theological education project providing supplementary education in Methodist studies for prospective pastors and for pastors doing further education. In addition, I do a bit of writing on various subjects, Methodist history, Methodist theology, ethics, the theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, eco-theology are kind of my areas of interest.
And we're going to talk today about one of your books. Now, what brings us to this conversation is a desire to talk about what it means to be United Methodist and why a person would choose to be a United Methodist today in the midst of the ongoing disagreements that we grapple with and in the midst of the possibility of a split. So we have posed the question for this series: should I stay or should I go? Tell us a little bit about your faith journey and where you stand on that question and why.
Well, perhaps important to note, I didn't grow up a Methodist. My father's family were actually Methodists, and ancestors were Methodists back to the 1820s. I grew up in a small conservative evangelical independent church. My initial theological studies was a very conservative Calvinistic orientated Bible college. But I think importantly, growing up in South Africa in the 1970s, a key part of my faith journey was how does my Christian faith relate to issues of racial justice and the struggle against apartheid. That was really kind of defining for me as I wrestled coming from a church which emphasized strongly personal faith and personal salvation and personal holiness. And the big question for me was, how does that relate to the struggles for justice? And that was really a theme, perhaps the first 10, 15 years of my theological life. And that really shaped me. Is there a theological framework that can hold these two things together? A second important kind of development for me was more personal. While I was in my doctoral program, a close friend, former girlfriend, came one day to me and shared with me that she was convinced, she had come to the conclusion she was lesbian, and she had her coming out experience with me. And I spent a lot of time walking with her through the coming out experience. That was also a challenge for my faith, coming from quite a conservative background, and I spent a lot of time wrestling with biblical passages dealing around sexuality. And at one point came to the conclusion of reflecting on Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, that Paul didn't know what he was talking about, which was kind of a shock to me in my faith. And again, the question, does Christian faith mean anything at all, or is it just purely myths and fairy stories? And I went through a number of years of kind of doubt and struggle. And interestingly, I've since left the university, completed my PhD teaching the University of Transkei, and met a group of people, Christians from diverse denominations with diverse theological perspectives, but met together once every 2 weeks for fellowship and Bible study. And they nurtured me back to faith. So it's a very diverse group, and from them, to quote a title of a book, I met Jesus again for the first time and discovered a new understanding of who Christ was, and his message and his understanding of including people who are otherwise excluded, of being in solidarity with the poor, the rejected, the excluded. That really shaped my thinking, and began to think this Christian faith does really make sense. If this is who God is in human form, wow, this is the kind of God I want to follow. I then moved on to Africa University and discovered United Methodism, which I didn't know before. And I suppose a highlight in anybody who's been to Africa University is the weekly chapel services. There's nothing quite like worshipping at Africa University's chapel services. A mixture of Wesleyan hymns and African culture and traditions, and it's really something amazing. So I was beginning to think, yeah, this Christianity makes sense. I was actually then thinking, maybe Methodism also makes sense, although I wasn't really, I was a member of the Presbyterian Church at that stage. After we got married, I moved to Germany, as I said, and I looked after our family and household and spent a lot of time also, while our kids were playing in the playground, I was sitting, reading and thinking of theology and life and what does it mean. And my wife then took a pastoral position in the UMC in Switzerland. And I was asked by Bishop Strife to project plan and lead a new program on online education. To do that, I delved into Methodism, theology of John Wesley, and really discovered suddenly I found a theological home. Wesley's strong emphasis on the centrality of love, God's love for us, our love for God, our love for each other, linking together personal piety and spirituality with a commitment to social justice, commitment to being on the side of the poor and the oppressed, his doctrine of prevenient grace, emphasizing God's work in all people throughout the world. And suddenly it really made sense to me. But also importantly at that stage was meeting people, young pastors from across Europe, in very different cultures and backgrounds, who really lived this message. People working often in very difficult circumstances, particularly in some Eastern European countries. Methodism is a minority church, working really amongst the poor, the excluded, the rejected in the societies. And so it wasn't only a theoretical thing, I suddenly saw it and it made sense to me and it lived. And then coming into Methodism, suddenly discovering there was this huge conflict going on in the church, which I didn't know about at all. And having gone through this whole experience, I've come to really understand the gospel message as one message which affirms and includes LGBTQ people, and suddenly discovered that this was a point of contention within the church. And more than that, discovering that the people who, in some ways, I saw living this faith held a more conservative position than I did. And so that really was a kind of a struggle for me. How do I hold this all together? That led me back into Wesley's theology and struggling with it and discovering in Wesley's theology resources for we can hold the core of the Christian faith and yet have the ability to tolerate difference and disagreements over a lot of issues and wrestle together with them. And that I explored in my other book, But Our Jarring Conflicts Cease. So I try to say it and really saying that within Methodism, within the tradition, there's a huge amount of theological resources that can help us deal with division and debate within the church. And I suppose for me, I found it tragic that we hadn't really mined those resources. I then spent some time working on the Commission on a Way Forward, looking at the future of the UMC and meeting with diverse people across the denomination. And again, strikingly, in people who with different views, discovering a common faith, a common commitment to Christ, a common heritage in the tradition. And so I've really found that in many ways, this is where I belong. This is where I live. And it's within the Methodist tradition, I find resources for helping me deal with all sorts of complex issues in our contemporary world. I enjoy the breadth of the church, that there are differences of opinion, because I know I need it. I need people to disagree with me and tell me where I'm wrong or where they think I'm wrong. I don't want to be in a place where everybody disagrees with me, because that you don't grow that way. I need to learn from others. I need to learn through this process of wrestling together, of living with different convictions and ideas. I need a multinational church, a church which crosses boundaries. Another feature of living in Europe in the past 20 years has been the issues around migration and the number of refugees coming into Europe. And just reflecting that many of the refugees coming from Africa are not just their fellow Christians, but that many of them are fellow Methodists and many of them are United Methodists. And when I think of the struggles in places like Congo or Angola, Zimbabwe, the people are really struggling to survive, these I'm connected with. They are my siblings. They're part of my church in a very real way. And when they come across to Europe, they're part of me. And I think that opens up new perspectives, particularly as we face in Europe and elsewhere in the world, sort of growing nationalism, an emphasis on keeping things for ourselves or building barriers. It's been really important to be part of a church which crosses those barriers and links me to people who I wouldn't normally be linked with. One of the, perhaps a personal note in terms of when I celebrate communion, which we do again here in Switzerland, we are now celebrating communion in person. But it's always been a time for me to reflect on other people around the world, around the connection. Might not be simultaneously celebrating communion because of time differences, but we'll be celebrating communion at a similar time. And I think of people, for example, who served with me on the commission on the way forward, with whom I thoroughly disagreed. I think they're also celebrating communion today. They are remembering Christ, they are participating in the body. And people who I agreed with, people who are suffering, people who have been good. And that really gives me a picture of what God's reign is all about.
It's somewhat, you've talked about a lot there. And what comes to mind, Wesley's words, though we might not think alike, let us love alike.
Yeah.
And you talk about the centrality of grace and the centrality of love that crosses those boundaries of difference. I want to point to a book that I have enjoyed of yours, Our Purpose is Love, The Wesleyan Way to Be the Church. You say in that book that love is the answer, not only for our time, but all time. That may seem obvious to people, but what struck me about that and what raised the question is, what is it in particular about our times today that would make that statement particularly true? What is it particular about our times now that would lead you to write such a statement if you were to write it again today?
It's a good question. I wrote that book while we were working in the commission on the way forward. And it really struck me that often we deal with church politics, we're dealing with try to new structures, new rules, new regulations, try to solve a problem. And what we really need is a vision for what it means to be church. And that in that context of conflict, it was important for me to re-emphasize the notion of love. Obviously, love can be sometimes seen somewhat sentimental and superficial. And I like Wesley often talks about love, and then he explains it using three other concepts: justice, compassion or mercy, and truth. And those things I find very helpful in our contemporary context. Compassion means really going out and standing in solidarity with those who are different, those who have other perspectives, those who are in need, those who are suffering. Justice also includes actually standing up against what is wrong and what is evil and what is oppressive in our society, in our church. And that's also important. And truth, integrity, I think is a quality we desperately need. And when we do see love in those terms, I think it gives us a picture of how we can begin to deal with a lot of different issues. Yes, the conflict in the church, but also in our societies. As we look at our different societies, conflict potentials, struggles, the pandemic we're living through at the moment. What does it mean to love our neighbors in the context of pandemic? What actions do we need to take? What things do we need to refrain from doing in order to ensure that we don't infect other people, that we don't get infected, and so on? I think, and this is where I would qualify my statement a little bit now, is to think I emphasize in the book, I think, quite a lot of self-giving love. I think that's important, but I think it does need to be qualified, because often in situations where people are forced to give of themselves and give of themselves and are actually being hurt by that kind of attitude, to then come and say, yes, now you must love those who are hurting you, those who are oppressing you, and you must be self-giving towards them. I think we need perhaps to recognize there that that love is also about truth-telling and saying, this situation is wrong. This situation is, you are oppressing me. You're doing what is wrong. And be prepared to stand up for truth. So I think that self-giving is important, but it needs to be complemented by other aspects in terms of dealing with love.
And the sense that self-giving does not mean sacrificing the image of God within self. Yeah. Or the well-being of self. And I love this idea that you have of love as the sacrificial commitment to the well-being of another, which should also be the well-being of the self. You say in your book that love is at the heart of God's mission in the world. How does that understanding relate to the call of the church, the United Methodist Church, as it goes forward, considering what we're dealing with? And how should such ideas impact decision-making for people who are thinking about, should I or should I not be a part of this church?
To me, when we think about mission of the church, I think an important part of mission is not just what we say and what we do, but also who we are. That we model an alternative to the society around us. And that's the key thing we find in Wesley's theology. And interestingly, when Wesley talks about mission, he focuses not so much on proclamation, but on the life of the church. And he says, if the church actually lived the gospel would spread. And the problem is not that the church isn't speaking enough, the church is not living enough. And so how do we live a life of love? And I think the United Methodist Church has an enormous opportunity to demonstrate to a world which is often fraught with conflict and disagreement what love is. To demonstrate an alternative by being the body of Christ. But because we are so different, because we are diverse cultures, diverse nations, diverse languages, diverse political and social opinions, and diverse theological opinions, I think if we can say, yes, we have this diversity, but we also love each other, and we support each other, and we pray for each other, and we are with each other, the people looking on can say, wow, these people are odd, they're different, they're strange, but in a way which is attractive. Sometimes Christians are odd and strange in ways which are off-putting in our cultures. Different cultures at different times. There was a time in Holland, I believe, where good Christians didn't ride bicycles. That was the sign of being a good Christian. And it's bizarre, it's strange. But if people look and say, as they did in the early church, see how they love each other, then I think we've got something to offer. And we've been in conflict in the church for 20 odd years or more. Can we not show something different, a way to deal with our problems and our real issues of diversity and difference in a way that demonstrates there's something different about this group, there's something that's attractive, something that can only be explained because God is amongst them.
And what a wonderful witness to the world right now that is so riven by all kinds of conflict. I'm going to do something really hard and maybe unfair. In your book, you describe the church in a lot of different ways. You describe the church as a covenant community, a welcoming community, a missional community, a countercultural community. You also define the church as a sacramental community, a connectional community, and a transnational community. Of all those adjectives, covenant, welcoming, missional, countercultural, sacramental, connectional, transnational, of all of those adjectives, pick one and highlight why it is an important aspect of the identity of or the future vision for the United Methodist Church. I know you wrote about all of them, but which would rise to the top today?
this is a difficult question. I'm reflecting on that because each of them kind of shape who I am and how I think about the church. I would like to pick on countercultural. As I said earlier on, sometimes the church has been associated with strange things in countercultural communities. And I do mention in the book that in Europe, for example, the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church is small. It's a minority church. People don't know much about it. It's often regarded, it's a sect-like church. So you have Methodists, Mormons, and Muslims are all together as kind of strange groups. The question is, what makes us different from the society around us? And there are different categories of that. And people, certainly in Europe, where you have highly secularized cultures, Western Europe, people look upon religion and upon the church as odd, as strange. It's not part of their daily life, perhaps different from the US, where the church is still much more part of the culture. And anything you do that seemed to be strange immediately opens you up for criticism, or for law, kind of makes you a laughing stock. There's regularly here in Basel, where I live, once a year, there's a big Christian youth rally. And in the local newspaper, it always has some strange comments about it, because somebody says something which really just, the rest of the society is laughable. So yes, we must be different, but we must be different in such a way that people say, hang on a minute, that difference is attractive, that's something I want, but which is also clear. No, we need to define boundaries. When I was growing up in South Africa in the 70s, many Christians, certainly evangelical Christians, emphasized being different from the society, being focused on Christ, and a lot of that focused around sexual morality, for example. But racism wasn't addressed at all. So you could be a good Christian and a racist, that was okay. And it just struck me, how absurd. How absurd. The key issue in the society we missed and focused on other issues. And I think it's important to say what in our particular context is the key issue where we as Christians must be different from the world around us in order to embody love. And that will be different in Switzerland from the US, or from different parts of the US. It'll be different from Congo or the Philippines or Bulgaria, Romania, as we move across the spectrum. In each of our contexts and countries, there'll be different ways of expressing that love. And we need to find what those ways are that is strikingly different. And that way is because, not just because we're looking for something to be different in an odd kind of way, because we are faithful to Christ. What does it mean to be faithful to Christ? To express God's love in a Christ-like way in our culture, dealing with the specific problems that we are facing in our situation.
And Christ was certainly countercultural. It was the early church was a countercultural movement as an expression of love. What else would you say, David, about your identity as United Methodist and about how you are thinking about the issues and the decisions facing the United Methodist Church today?
Well, as I said earlier, for me, Methodism has become my theological home. It's the way where I feel most comfortable with in terms of my own theological persuasions. And I find it difficult to leave. I would really find it really difficult to leave. I faced this in a different context a few years ago when my wife, had been pastor in the Methodist Church, decided to took up a position in the Reformed Church here in Basel. And the question was, do I switch my membership? Do I follow my wife into the Reformed Church, or do I stay a Methodist? And for me, it was very clear I was going to stay a Methodist. I would come to her services and listen to her preach, but I would also join the local Methodist congregation. And so I do both. I attend both services different weeks. So, because to me, what was really important, I think, is being part of a diverse family that crosses boundaries. I experienced that in different contexts, and I don't want to give that up. I need my brothers and sisters, my siblings, who are different from me. I need those who are perhaps theologically would describe themselves as more conservative or more progressive or more liberal. They correct me, they open my eyes, they help me to see things from a different perspective. Interestingly here, we recently had a lot of controversy. Well, let me say, Switzerland has its unique culture and context. It's politically part of Europe, it's not politically part of the European Union, but it has certain agreements with the European Union. And as a result of those agreements with the European Union, there's freedom of movement, so people can come from different countries and move into it. And about 6 months ago, a year ago, there was suddenly a large number of people coming from Eastern Europe into the city and living on the streets, begging, and there was a huge outcry. And then one of the politicians said, what we really need to do is be working in Romania, where these people are coming for, and doing development work that they don't become poor, that they actually can, they can stay there. That was part of the idea, they must stay there. But, we can really help them. That struck me, but that's what we're doing as Methodists. We've been doing that for the past 20 years. We have churches in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Hungary, amongst these very communities. We've been doing it, and the politicians are only caught up with it now. And that kind of excited me, that the church is doing things which are really important in the lives of people across the world. One can think of many things. One can think of the work of UMCOR or some of our development work we're doing. We think of relief work. It's just huge what the United Methodist Church is doing. And we can be part of that. And that's, to me, is really important.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And I am so looking forward, because we're going to have you come back again in November and talk a little bit more in depth about questions around Christian perfection and holiness, kind of how we grow in Christ and how we understand that from a Wesleyan and from a United Methodist perspective. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.